My name is Susana Ashcroft, 28 years old. The drums from the honor guard still thudded in my ribcage as if they'd taken up residence there. A slow, martial echo that made breathing feel like a decision. Inside the paneled study of the Virginia house, cedar, wax, and the faint metallic scent of gun oil clinging to the wood, the lawyer said my name and everyone turned to look. Not the kind of look that holds you up, the kind that weighs you down to see what you're worth. On the table, a leather folio lay open like a quiet mouth. Mr. Halloway adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and announced the bulk of the estate to my parents with practiced solemnity. Property, accounts, interests. The words clicked like locks. My father's chuckle came out low and satisfied, hiding inside a sip of bourbon. Guess the old man finally knew where to invest, he said, not bothering to keep the glee from his voice. My mother dabbed at the outer corners of eyes that were untroubled by tears, and murmured something about gratitude and legacy. Thomas, my older brother, leaned back in his chair and crossed his ankle over a knee. He wasn't smiling, which for him meant he was busy calculating renovations, racehorses, or whatever new hobby could eat a small fortune in a season. For Lieutenant Ashcroft, the lawyer continued, and a hush that was almost polite draped itself over the room. He slid a small envelope toward me, heavy cream with a seal I could have traced from memory. HAC. Henry Allen Carter. My grandfather's initials, pressed deep into red wax. The floor seemed to tilt. I had worn the uniform because he believed I could. He had stood at my commissioning with the unblinking pride of a man who'd learned the cost of applause. I picked up the envelope. It felt lighter than my father's laugh and heavier than the silence that followed it. No shares, no fund, no cottage, Dad said, eyebrows rising. Looks like the general believed in tough love. His smile was the shape of a blade. Richard, my mother warned in a tone that suggested the warning was part of the performance. It's fine, I said, my voice even. Grandpa never liked clutter. Clutter? Thomas lifted an eyebrow. That's one name for an estate. In the corner, the folded flag from the morning's funeral rested against a chair, angles crisp enough to cut your palm. Through the window, the October light sat low and gold on the lawn, and I thought about how duty could feel like sunlight and shadow in the same hour. The lawyer's gaze flickered to me, brief and apologetic, and then away again. One of those small human gestures that says, I know more, I can't say it. Take what you've been given and read it carefully. It was gone in a blink, but it caught on something inside me. A thread. I excused myself before the congratulations could sharpen into cruelty. The hallway smelled like cedar and old paper. Outside, the air had that cold, clean edge it gets in late fall, the kind that wakes your skin. I sat on the stone steps and turned the envelope over. The wax cracked with a soft snap that felt louder than the 21-gun salute. Inside, one sheet of thick stationery and a sliver of something that fluttered in the breeze. Susana, the letter said, the handwriting square and patient, the way he had written on maps. You've served quietly. Now learn why. Report to London. Duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Grandpa. The second item was a plane ticket. Washington Dulles to Heathrow. First flight out in the morning. One way. A laugh snagged in my throat and became a breath. Of course he'd make it a mission. Of course the coordinates would be a city. My father would say I'd always been a dreamer, and my mother would say not to make a scene. And Thomas would say it wasn't his business, and every one of them would pretend none of this bothered them, because pretending was our family's first language. I stood and went back inside. In the foyer, glass chimed somewhere in a room full of congratulations. Dad intercepted me, catching the light with his cufflinks. Don't tell me you're actually chasing that, he said, tipping his glass toward the envelope. London is expensive, and middle seats. I'll manage, I said. You always say that right before you don't. I won't call when the money runs out, I replied, not raising my voice. You can keep your bourbon. For a heartbeat, something like surprise crossed his face. Then the old smirk returned, practiced and polished. Your rank won't open many doors over there, sweetheart. Ranks never opened the doors that mattered to him, I said, and walked past him. In the quiet of my childhood room, I packed with the efficiency service teaches you. 2 uniforms, 1 Navy file. The letter slipped where I could touch it without taking it out. The folded flag stayed on the bed, a sentinel. In the mirror, my posture was straight and my eyes were the color of not sleeping. Under my breath, I said the sentence he had whispered at my commissioning, the one I hadn't fully understood until I'd watched Marines fold his life into that triangle of cloth. When you wear it, you carry those who can't. Dawn was ink blue and breath white as the cab cut past Arlington. The rows of headstones threw thin shadows across the frost. The driver had the radio low. A newscaster murmured about markets and weather, and the word honor floated up like a leaf in water and drifted out the window into the cold. At Dulles, the fluorescent light licked color out of everything. I handed over my ticket and the gate agent blinked. "Ms. Ashcroft, you've been upgraded," she said, double-checking the screen. "Courtesy of—" She paused, eyes narrowing with curiosity. She was too professional to indulge. "The Royal Embassy." My mouth shaped a thank you that didn't quite escape. Invisible hands had adjusted the path 3 inches in my favor. That was either generosity or a trap. With Grandpa, those were sometimes the same thing. Above the Atlantic, sunlight spilled like metal through cloud openings. I read the letter a dozen times, and each time the words rearranged themselves into more questions. Why London? Why now? What does learn why mean to a man who taught me everything by refusing to explain it? He had told me once, after a memorial ceremony, that the bravest thing a soldier learns is how to obey without abandoning thought, to hold a line and doubt it simultaneously. The mind is a compass, the heart checks the map. The wheels touched down in drizzle the color of old coins. Heathrow smelled like coffee and rain-wet coats, and 1,000 conversations polite enough to blur. My boots clicked on tile. The crowd thinned, and then I saw him. A man in a tailored black coat, posture like a metronome, holding a small white placard. L.T. Susana Ashcroft, written in a hand too elegant to be casual. He lowered the sign when our eyes met and brought his fingers to his brow in a salute that lived between tradition and discretion. "Ma'am," he said, voice crisp, vowels honed. He presented a leather wallet that opened onto credentials embossed with a crown I'd only seen in photographs. "If you'll follow me." "Follow you where?" I asked, though I already felt the answer in the quiet way the air around him deferred. "Her Majesty has requested your presence," he said. "You were expected." The terminal noise dulled for a second, as if someone had turned the volume of London down to let the sentence fit. Expected. By whom and for what? 2 questions that lit up like runways. Behind his courteous face, I saw another expression flicker, as brief as the lawyer's glance had been yesterday. Relief. As if a problem he'd been assigned had just walked itself to his side. Outside, rain stitched the air into a fine gray net. The car waiting at the curb was both discreet and unmistakable, black, polished to diplomatic understatement, the plate a crown instead of numbers. The driver opened the door, and for a moment the leather smell carried something else. Age, money, the patience of institutions that plan in centuries. I hesitated with one foot on the threshold and thought about the distance between an insult in a wood-paneled study and a summons that carried a sovereign's signature without her name. My phone buzzed in my pocket, texts piling up from numbers tied to a house that spoke fluent mockery. I silenced the screen without reading. Duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It only changes clothes. I slid into the car. The door thumped shut with the confidence of walls that keep their secrets until the right person asks the right question. The driver glanced at me in the rear view and, without turning down the rain, said, "Welcome to London, Lieutenant." For the first time since the salutes cracked over the gravesite, the drum in my chest quieted. Not because I felt safe, but because the next step was finally mine to take. The car pulled into the flow of traffic, wipers ticking time. I folded the letter once more, the paper warm from my hand, and let my grandfather's sentence find its old steady rhythm in my head. When we cleared the terminal and the city opened like a guarded book, the driver spoke again. "Directly to the palace, ma'am?" I looked out through the gray shimmer to where the skyline sharpened and felt something like gravity realign. "Yes," I said, "directly." The rain in London didn't fall, it whispered. It threaded through the air like static, as if the city were quietly charging itself. The black car wove past gray facades and red double-deckers, its engine humming like a secret. Every few minutes, I caught the driver glancing at me in the mirror. Not curiosity exactly, but the way a man looks at someone carrying orders he isn't cleared to read. "Her Majesty has requested your presence personally," he said once, voice steady. I didn't answer. I was busy memorizing the way the raindrops slid down the window in erratic patterns, like Morse code trying to tell me something my grandfather hadn't. When the car slowed, I realized we'd turned through iron gates marked by a golden crest. Guards saluted. Credentials flashed. Tires crunched on wet stone. And then there it was, the royal estate, massive and pale, rising through fog like a memory of power. Inside, the air was different. It didn't smell like old money or history. It smelled like order, polished wood, beeswax, and quiet authority. A tall man in uniform waited at the top of the stairs. He had the kind of posture that made you stand straighter without thinking. "Lieutenant Ashcroft," he said, offering his hand. "I'm Sir Edmund Fairchild, private secretary to Her Majesty." His handshake was firm, but not possessive, the kind of strength that comes from knowing precisely how much to give. "You must be wondering why you're here," he said as we began walking through a corridor lined with portraits. The faces of long-dead monarchs seemed to track us with dignified suspicion. "That's an understatement," I replied. Sir Edmund smiled faintly. "Your grandfather was a man of service and secrecy. The Queen held him in the highest regard." My boots echoed softly against the marble floor. "He was a general," I said carefully. "Not exactly in the habit of royalty." "General Henry Carter Ashcroft," he corrected gently, "was more than a soldier. During the Cold War, he commanded a joint humanitarian operation between our nations, classified at the time. He prevented what might have been a catastrophe. Few knew it existed. Fewer knew what it cost him." I stopped walking. "You're saying he worked for British intelligence?" Sir Edmund's lips curved slightly, in a manner of speaking. "He was trusted here, deeply. So much so that Her Majesty once offered him a personal commendation. He declined." "Why?" "Because he asked that the honor be deferred." We stopped before a table draped in royal blue velvet. On it rested a small leather case embossed with two emblems, the Union Jack and the American Eagle. "Deferred to when?" I asked. He gestured toward the case. "To you." My pulse hitched. Inside, nestled against velvet, was a gold and silver medal intertwined with both nations' insignias, and a sealed envelope in handwriting I recognized immediately. Grandpa's. I unfolded the letter. "Susana," it read. "I declined my honor so that one day it could mean something greater. If you're reading this, you've earned it, not by rank, but by service. Deliver this medal where it belongs. The Queen will understand." My throat tightened. Sir Edmund's voice softened. "Your grandfather wanted you to complete what he began. A final mission, if you will. But first, there's something you need to see." He led me down a narrow staircase, deeper into the palace, past guards and corridors that grew quieter the further we went. The air cooled. The light shifted to sterile white. "The archives," he said, "beneath St. James's Palace. Rows of locked cabinets stretched into the distance, each marked with coded abbreviations. MOD, NATO, JSO, and a few symbols I didn't recognize. Your grandfather's materials were sealed in 1984, he explained. They were to be opened only by a direct bloodline with active service credentials." "That explains the ticket," I murmured. He stopped before a reinforced door. After scanning his credentials and my passport, he pressed his palm to a biometric reader. The lock hissed and the door swung open. Inside sat a single metal case labeled Carter, Henry A., Joint Service File. Sir Edmund gestured. "It's yours." I stepped closer, hesitated, then unlatched the case. The smell of old ink and faint tobacco rose like memory. Inside were journals, leather, frayed, their pages dense with tidy handwriting, along with photographs and official letters sealed with twin insignias. The first journal entry began simply, "If Susana ever finds this, tell her that some honors must be earned twice. Once in life, once in memory." I turned the pages. There were photos of soldiers, British and American, standing in bombed-out towns, handing out food, rebuilding schools. Some faces I recognized from his old albums. Others were strangers, ghosts, now bound in glossy paper. "He worked alongside our officers," Sir Edmund said quietly, "not for power or recognition, but because he believed in the same creed, leave no one behind." Tucked between the pages was a photograph that made my breath catch. Grandpa stood beside a younger Queen Elizabeth, both in uniform, smiling as if they'd just survived something monumental. Beneath it, written in his block letters, "True allies never retire." I closed the book carefully. He really was one of them. Sir Edmund nodded. "And now, so are you." Before I could answer, he opened a small wooden drawer in the archive table and withdrew a thin folder marked Operation Remembrance. These, he said, were the files your grandfather requested be shown to his successor. They outline a veterans relief initiative he funded privately for decades. It ceased operation after his passing. You have the authority to reactivate it. I skimmed the first page. Housing grants, scholarships, reintegration programs, tangible service to the forgotten. This wasn't just charity, I said, it's infrastructure. Precisely, and it needs someone with both integrity and authority to restore it. I didn't even know he left me anything. Sir Edmund smiled faintly. He didn't leave you a thing, Lieutenant. He left you a purpose. The words hit harder than I expected. As I stood in that sterile, humming vault, I realized the medal wasn't the gift. It was the key. Grandpa hadn't trusted his son, my father, with this legacy. He'd trusted me. And the realization was both honor and heartbreak. There's one more document, Sir Edmund added. He handed me a sealed envelope stamped above clearance level. Your grandfather instructed that this be delivered directly to Her Majesty upon your arrival. I stared at it. What's inside? He gave the smallest shrug. That is beyond my clearance, Lieutenant. That evening, I was escorted through a private corridor and into a small, sunlit room. The air smelled faintly of roses and old books. Standing near a window overlooking the gardens was a woman in a powder blue dress and pearls. She turned as I entered. So, you are Henry Ashcroft's granddaughter, she said, her voice kind but weighted with authority. He spoke of you often. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Your Majesty, I managed, saluting instinctively before realizing how absurd it must look. She chuckled softly. At ease, my dear. We are allies, after all. I lowered my hand, still stunned. I didn't know. Few did, she interrupted gently. Your grandfather's service extended beyond medals. He believed true honor is found in quiet acts, not grand ceremonies. I hesitated, then drew the medal case from my bag and placed it before her. He asked me to deliver this where it belongs. Her eyes softened. Then he trusted you with his unfinished work. She opened the case and studied the medal, the insignias gleaming in the light. He told me once, she said, almost to herself, that he'd give this honor to someone who understood that leadership is not inheritance, it's stewardship. My throat felt tight. I'm not sure I understand it yet. You will, she said. Legacy is never about what you receive, it's about what you carry forward. The words landed like a command wrapped in kindness. When I left the palace, dusk had fallen. The rain had stopped. The city lights reflected off wet pavement like constellations rearranged by human hands. The driver waited by the car, umbrella poised. Where to now, ma'am? I looked down at the leather case in my hands, the metal glinting faintly through its open seam. For the first time, I said quietly, I think I know. Very good, ma'am. He opened the door. I hesitated for half a heartbeat longer, then stepped in. As the car rolled through the gates, I pressed the envelope, the one meant for the Queen, against my palm. I could feel the faint ridge of something inside, not paper, something metallic. Whatever Grandpa had set in motion, it hadn't ended here. It had just begun. By morning, London felt different. Not the weather, still gray, still drizzling, but the air carried a purpose I could almost touch. I woke in the guest quarters the palace had arranged, my uniform hanging beside the window, the medal's reflection catching the faint light like an accusation. You're not finished. A knock came just after 7. Sir Edmund stood there with a younger aide in a crisp blazer. This is Clara Whitmore, he said. She's been assigned to assist you with the remembrance documentation. Clara's smile was polite but curious. The files are waiting at the Treasury office, Lieutenant. They require your signature to reauthorize funding. We rode in silence through the narrow streets, past corner shops and rain-glossed cobblestones. London's rhythm was deliberate, unhurried, yet somehow it felt as though the entire city already knew I was here for something that mattered. At the Treasury, the documents were arranged neatly in a single folder. Clara laid them before me, one page at a time. Remembrance Foundation. Joint U.S.-UK Humanitarian Initiative. Status. Dormant since 2003. There was an interruption, she said, tracing a finger down a list of transactions. Funds from the American branch were frozen due to administrative disputes. Disputes? I asked. Sir Edmund interlaced his fingers. A polite word for mismanagement. Your father's name appears in several entries. My breath hitched. My father? He nodded slowly. General Ashcroft granted him limited oversight of the American accounts decades ago, strictly custodial. Unfortunately, he used that access to divert portions of the funds into personal holdings. Nothing technically illegal, but deeply unethical. For a moment, I couldn't speak. It felt like the floor under me had shifted, but the world above hadn't noticed. Clara spoke gently. The Queen chose not to intervene out of respect for your grandfather's privacy, but she believed the day would come when you'd set things right. I stared at the ledger. The column of figures was clinical. Numbers, dates, transfers, but behind them I saw faces. Veterans who should have had homes. Families who should have had help. So that's why Grandpa sent me here, I murmured. He knew. Sir Edmund's voice was low. He knew his son couldn't be trusted with legacy, but he believed his granddaughter could. The weight of that trust pressed against my chest until it hurt. Clara placed a pen beside the papers. If you sign here, Lieutenant, you'll formally reactivate the Remembrance Foundation. The assets will revert to joint supervision. The British branch will resume operations immediately. And my father? Will lose control of every account connected to it. I looked down at the line where my name would go. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the awareness that a single signature could ignite a quiet war. Family on one side, duty on the other. I signed. Each stroke of the pen felt final, the ink dark as resolve. When I set the pen down, Sir Edmund nodded once. Congratulations, Lieutenant Ashcroft. The Remembrance Foundation is alive again. Alive. The word rang in my mind. Grandpa's project, buried under greed, forgotten in ledgers, had a pulse once more. We left the building to find the clouds thinning, the drizzle turning into faint sunlight. Clara offered a small smile. He'd be proud of you, you know. Maybe, I said, or maybe he just knew I wouldn't let it go. Back at my hotel, I spread the documents across the desk. For the first time since his funeral, I felt like I was standing beside him again. His steady breathing, his quiet certainty, that belief in service without spectacle. I opened my laptop and began drafting an internal memo for the Foundation's reactivation. But as I typed, the screen blurred with the reflection of the metal lying beside it. I ran a thumb across the engraved words, "For service beyond borders." That night, I couldn't sleep. The city hummed beyond the glass, muted by fog. Somewhere, a clock struck midnight, and the sound folded neatly into my thoughts. If Grandpa had built this network quietly, then the corruption that killed it had spread just as silently. I imagined my father's face when he found out. The denial first, then the fury. But this wasn't vengeance, it was correction. I packed before dawn. Medal, charter, passport. The sealed folder marked, above clearance level, still unopened. The royal driver waited outside as if he'd known my plan before I did. "Back to Heathrow, ma'am?" "Yes," I said, "back to Virginia." As the plane lifted through the mist, I looked down at the city shrinking beneath me. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I was bringing something back. Hours later, the autumn air in Virginia smelled sharper. Oak, smoke, and the faint sweetness of decay. My childhood home stood at the crest of the hill, proud and indifferent. Dad was waiting in the driveway, coffee in hand, sunglasses hiding his eyes. "Well, look who's returned from her royal vacation," he said. "Did the Queen offer you a palace job?" "Not quite," I said, stepping past him. Mom appeared behind him, her posture stiff, her smile thinner than memory. "You should have called, Susana. The neighbors asked where you went. It was embarrassing." I didn't think it mattered. Inside, nothing had changed. The same family portraits, the same trophies. Grandpa's photo hung in the center, his uniform framed by pride he'd never claimed. Dinner was waiting, roast chicken, polished silver, conversation sharp as glass. "So," Dad said, slicing his meat, "what exactly were you doing in London? Sightseeing? Shopping?" I set my fork down. "I went to Buckingham Palace." Thomas snorted. "Sure you did." Dad laughed. "What, tea with the Queen?" "Her private secretary, actually," I said evenly. "Sir Edmund Fairchild. We discussed the foundation Grandpa built with the British government." The laughter died slowly, like a candle guttering out. Dad's eyes narrowed. "What foundation?" "The Remembrance Foundation. He left it to me." "That's impossible. I was the executor of his estate." "Not for the classified branches, you weren't." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the mantel. Dad leaned back, swirling his wine. "Even if that nonsense were true, it has nothing to do with us anymore." "It has everything to do with us," I said quietly, "especially with what you did to it." His hand froze midair. "What I did?" "I've seen the ledgers, Dad, the accounts. The transfers under Carter Holdings. Color drained from his face. Mom glanced between us, confused. Richard, what is she talking about? He stood abruptly, the chair scraping. You have no idea what you're accusing me of. I have every idea, I said. You turned veterans' funds into personal investments. That ends today. Ends? His voice cracked into a scoff. You don't have the authority. I do now. I pulled a document from my coat and slid it across the table. The Reactivation Charter, signed under joint government authority. Every asset returns to its rightful purpose. Mom's voice trembled. Susana, please, you're going to ruin this family. No, I said softly. I'm going to save its name. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Years of unspoken resentment, pride, and betrayal, settling into their proper places. I stood. Good night. As I reached the doorway, Dad's voice followed, low and dangerous. You think you've won something? No, I said without turning back. I think I've just begun. Outside, the cold night air met my skin like absolution. Above the dark trees, a single plane crossed the sky, its lights blinking red against black, London to somewhere else, maybe. I watched it disappear and thought of Grandpa's letter. Duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Maybe this was the duty he'd meant. The battles you fight without weapons, in rooms where love and greed wear the same face. I walked to my car, the folder on the passenger seat, the metal gleaming faintly in the dashboard light. Tomorrow, the world would find out. By morning, the air in the house had changed. Not in temperature, but in tension. Thick, metallic, the kind that hums before a storm. I left before sunrise, the gravel crunching under my boots, loud enough to wake the ghosts of this place. Dad's car was still in the driveway. The porch light was still on. Nothing moved, but I could feel him watching from one of the windows. I drove to Richmond with the kind of clarity that doesn't need caffeine. The highway was a gray ribbon stretching through mist, and every mile felt like a countdown to confrontation. In the passenger seat, the metal case and the sealed envelope from the Queen rested side by side. 2 weights, 2 responsibilities. Mr. Halloway's office was on Main Street, tucked between a bank and a law firm that smelled like old carpets and ambition. The last time I'd sat across from him, he'd handed me the envelope that started this all. When I walked in, his eyes widened in surprise. Lieutenant Ashcroft, he said, standing quickly. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I'm here to finalize something, I said, placing the folder on his desk. He opened it, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tap of his pen against the blotter. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his expression. Respect, tinged with apprehension. You're reinstating the Remembrance Foundation, he said slowly, and transferring all associated assets back under joint oversight. That's correct. You understand what that means, don't you? Your father will lose control of several holdings. I know. He hesitated, studying me. Your grandfather once told me you had his stubborn streak. I didn't realize how right he was. I allowed a faint smile. Stubbornness runs in the family. I'm just using it differently. He signed the necessary paperwork, each stamp landing like a gavel. It's done, he said quietly. Legally, the foundation belongs to you now. No one can challenge it, not even your father. When I left his office, the first rays of sunlight were cutting through the fog. I stood on the steps and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of rain-soaked brick and beginnings. My phone rang halfway back to the estate. Dad's name flashed across the screen. I considered ignoring it, but the soldier in me knew avoidance wasn't victory. I answered. What did you do? His voice thundered through the line, raw and barely restrained. I fulfilled Grandpa's last wish, I said. Halloway told me you filed something with the Treasury. You had no right. I had every right, legally, ethically, morally. The foundation is active again. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Yes, I said simply. I restored what you broke. Silence on the line, heavy enough to feel. When he finally spoke again, his tone was quieter. You don't understand how this looks, Susana. I think I do. It looks like accountability. I hung up before he could reply. By the time I reached home, the media had already found the story. The headline blared across every screen. Queen endorses U.S.-UK Veterans Trust. General Carter's granddaughter to lead reactivation. My name sat directly beneath Grandpa's, the photo of me, beside Sir Edmund, taken outside Buckingham Palace, gleaming under digital light. The caption read, Honoring a legacy of service across generations. For a long moment, I just stared at it. Not pride, not shock, just the quiet realization that the secret mission had gone public, and there was no turning back. By noon, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Texts, missed calls, notifications piling up like debris. My brother's message was brief. "You really went royal, huh?" Mom's read, "We need to talk." When I arrived that evening, the front gate was open, a rare gesture in a house that prided itself on privacy. The air around the estate buzzed with agitation. Dad was pacing the foyer, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, his composure cracking. "You've humiliated us," he said the moment he saw me. I met his gaze steadily. "No, Dad. I revealed us." "You think you're better than your own family now?" "No," I said. "I think I finally understand what family's supposed to mean." He slammed his palm against the table. "You destroyed everything your grandfather built." "I saved what he built," I shot back. "You're just angry that for once you're not the one wearing the uniform." The words hit him like shrapnel. He froze, jaw tightening, but his eyes said what his mouth couldn't. I was right. Mom stepped forward, wringing her hands, voice trembling between fear and pleading. "Your father worked hard for this family, Susana, for everything we have." "With Grandpa's money," I interrupted, "money meant for veterans' housing, for scholarships. You turned it into marble foyers and vineyards." Her face blanched. "We didn't know. You knew enough to stay quiet." No one spoke. The silence expanded, thick and electric. Finally, Dad exhaled through his teeth, his anger collapsing into something smaller, panic maybe. "You've disgraced us," he whispered. "No," I said, "I've honored him." He turned away, gripping the edge of the table as if it might anchor him. "You think this makes you a hero?" "I think it makes me honest." Mom's eyes glistened. "What happens now?" "An audit," I said simply. "Every diverted dollar will be traced and restored. The foundation's work will continue, and this family will finally face what it's done." Her breath caught. "Susana, that could ruin us." "It could redeem us," I said softly, "if you let it." Dad said nothing. His reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, his confidence hollowed by truth. I walked to the door, my footsteps echoing in the room that had once held laughter and now held only echoes of pride. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. I stood on the porch, watching the sky deepen from navy to black. Somewhere in that vast silence, I imagined Grandpa's laugh, low, knowing, proud. I whispered the words he used to say whenever I hesitated before a challenge. "Stand your ground, Susana. Someday they'll salute you." The cicadas hummed like applause. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the forgotten one in the back row. I felt like the one carrying the torch. And the world had finally turned to look. 3 days later, the silence of our estate was shattered by noise, calls from reporters, emails from veterans groups, letters from Parliament, and even one from the Pentagon. The story had spread beyond Virginia. The granddaughter of a forgotten general had resurrected a legacy that spanned 2 nations. Dad stopped answering his phone. Mom stayed in her room. Thomas texted once. "You really did it." Then nothing more. I stayed busy. The audit began at dawn, a team of investigators combing through decades of financial records. Watching them move through our house felt like watching surgeons operate on a dying patient. Precise, deliberate, clinical. Clara called that afternoon. "You handled it perfectly," she said. "The royal office is impressed." "I wasn't trying to impress anyone," I said. "I know, that's why it worked." She hesitated before adding, "Sir Edmund asked me to tell you. Her Majesty has requested your attendance at the Foundation's inauguration ceremony next week, in Washington." I blinked. "You mean a public event?" "Yes. There will be officials from both governments, veterans' families, and international press. You'll be speaking as director." I laughed softly, disbelieving. "I'm not a politician." "No," she said. "You're a soldier who tells the truth. That's rarer." When we hung up, I stared at the medal on my desk. "For service beyond borders." Grandpa's words echoed again. "Deliver this medal where it belongs." Maybe this was what he meant. Not to hand it to someone else, but to stand where he couldn't. The following week moved in a blur of logistics and sleepless nights. The audit results arrived quietly. The missing funds confirmed. The diversions traced back to shell accounts under Carter Holdings. It was damning but clean. Proof enough for restitution without prosecution. I'd requested the reports remain sealed, unless necessary. Grandpa had always believed in justice, not spectacle. On the morning of the ceremony, the auditorium in D.C. gleamed like a polished promise. Rows of uniforms, medals, and folded flags shimmered under the lights. A portrait of Grandpa stood beside the stage, his eyes steady even in stillness. Sir Edmund met me backstage, immaculate as ever. Her Majesty sends her warm regards, he said, and she asked me to deliver this. He handed me a slim envelope bearing the royal crest. Inside was a single page. Confidential directive. Operation Remembrance Continuation. At the bottom, a handwritten note in familiar script. Your grandfather's deferred commendation remains contingent on the restoration of all misused funds without criminal reprisal against family, unless obstruction persists. I read it twice. It wasn't just a formality, it was a condition, a moral line drawn decades ago. Grandpa hadn't wanted vengeance. He'd wanted redemption. Everything all right, Lieutenant? Sir Edmund asked. I folded the letter. It will be. When they called my name, I stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of uniforms. The podium light caught the medal pinned to my chest, casting a faint reflection across the portrait beside me. Good morning, I began, voice steady despite the weight in my throat. When I was a child, my grandfather told me that a soldier never truly retires. She just changes her battlefield. I paused, letting the words settle. I didn't understand what he meant then, but standing here I do. Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It begins again, quietly, in the choices we make afterward. Faces blurred together in the audience. Generals, veterans, widows, students. I spoke about honor, about the quiet courage of those who rebuild without recognition, about what it meant to inherit something larger than wealth. Legacy, I said, isn't about what we keep. It's about what we return. When I finished, there was silence. Then applause, soft at first, then rising like a tide. A few veterans stood, saluting. Others wiped their eyes. Sir Edmund joined me on stage, his expression unreadable. Your grandfather would have been proud, he said quietly. I hope so. He once told me, Sir Edmund added, that his granddaughter would know what to do when the time came. I believe he was right. That night, back at the hotel, I replayed every word of that directive. No criminal reprisal unless obstruction persists. Grandpa had left me not just power but boundaries. He'd known revenge was easy. Redemption required discipline. My phone buzzed just after midnight. A text from Dad. Your speech was something. I didn't understand before. I do now. I'm sorry. I read it twice, the screen light soft against the dark. For the first time, the silence between us didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I didn't reply. Not yet. Some truths didn't need words. They just needed time. Outside, Washington's skyline gleamed against the Potomac. The city pulsed with quiet purpose, alive with the same energy I'd felt the moment I opened Grandpa's envelope in Virginia. I walked to the window and touched the metal, its surface cool against my skin. Mission accomplished, I whispered. But the work isn't over. Somewhere, in the space between justice and forgiveness, the general's legacy had found its heartbeat again. Spring returned to Virginia like a whispered apology. The frost melted from the vineyard hills, and the air smelled of lilac and damp earth. The scandal had burned itself out months ago. Headlines replaced by newer crises, audits quietly concluded, the Remembrance Foundation thriving again. Homes had been built, scholarships granted. Veterans who'd once slept under bridges now slept under roofs their service had paid for. It was working. He was working through me. But I hadn't gone home since that night in the foyer, when my father called me a disgrace and my mother couldn't look at me. Not until now. The car idled beneath the old oak Grandpa had planted the year I was born. I stepped out in my navy dress uniform, the metal catching sunlight through the branches. It wasn't vanity, it was reverence. Mom answered the door before I could knock. She looked smaller than I remembered, hair gray at the roots, voice uncertain. You look beautiful, Susana. Thank you, Mom. She hesitated. Your father's in the garden. I nodded. The path was still lined with white stones he'd placed himself, back when order was his religion. The grass beyond shimmered with dew, and at the far end, near the rose bushes, stood the marble plaque. General Henry A. Ashcroft served both duty and humanity. Dad was kneeling beside it, trimming the grass, with slow, deliberate movements. His once polished hair was streaked with silver now, his shoulders slightly stooped. When he looked up, I didn't see arrogance anymore. I saw exhaustion, and maybe regret. I didn't think you'd come, he said softly. I wasn't sure I would, I admitted. He set the shears down, exhaling like someone unburdening himself. I needed time to face what I did, to him, to you, to what our name stood for. I joined him by the grave. The air was still, respectful. He adjusted the small US and UK flags planted side by side. He'd like this, I said quietly. 2 nations together, just like his medal. Dad smiled faintly. He always believed strength came from alliances. I never understood that until I watched your speech. We stood in silence. The wind moved through the branches, gentle and forgiving. He turned toward me after a while. You know, I was furious at first, thought you'd betrayed the family. Then I realized you were the only one who remembered who we were supposed to be. The words cracked something in me I hadn't realized was still brittle. I didn't want to destroy anything, Dad. I just couldn't let it die in greed. You didn't destroy it, he said quietly. You redeemed it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small weathered box. Your grandfather gave this to me after my first promotion, told me to pass it on when I finally understood what leadership meant. He handed it to me. Inside lay a single silver chess piece, the queen. One day, he said, repeating Grandpa's words, give this to the person who understands the game better than you ever did. I guess he knew it would be you. I laughed softly, half choking on tears. He always did love symbolism. We stood there together, not as adversaries, but as something closer, 2 soldiers who'd finally laid down their weapons. Mom appeared a few minutes later, holding a bouquet of white roses. Her eyes were wet, but her voice steady. I'm sorry, Susana, for what I said that day, for what I thought of you. I took her hand gently. It's okay, Mom. We all saw what we wanted to see back then. She shook her head. No, you saw what mattered. She knelt and placed the roses by the plaque. The wind carried their scent upward, light and clean. Together, the 3 of us bowed our heads. When we walked back toward the house, Dad stopped at the porch steps. We want to help, he said. The foundation, however we can. Not for credit, just to make it right. I smiled. Then start with the Veterans Housing Project in Norfolk. They could use a good construction team. His eyebrows rose. You'd trust me with that? I'm not giving you the project, I said, smiling wider. I'm offering you a chance to serve. He nodded, understanding perfectly. That evening, I drove east toward the coast, the same stretch of shoreline where Grandpa used to take me fishing when I was a child. The water shimmered gold beneath the setting sun, calm and endless. I parked the car and walked to the edge, the sound of waves steady as a heartbeat. From my pocket, I took the silver chess piece and turned it in my hand. It glinted like a secret made visible. You were right, Grandpa, I whispered. Some battles aren't fought in wars. They're fought in living rooms, at dinner tables, inside the hearts of people who forgot what honor means. The wind caught my words and carried them toward the horizon. When I drove back to the city, dusk had settled into that perfect hour between shadow and light. The new headquarters of the Remembrance Foundation rose modestly at the corner of 2 quiet streets, glass, steel, and humility. Inside, the lobby was alive with the hum of work. Volunteers sorted supplies, answered calls, laughed softly under the fluorescent glow. On the wall behind the reception desk, 2 flags hung side by side, and beneath them, a brass plaque engraved with Grandpa's words. Service isn't what we do for medals. It's what we do when no one is watching. General Henry A. Ashcroft. I walked through the halls, pausing at the office that bore my name on a small plate. On the desk, I left a note for the morning staff. Let's remember that every decision we make here honors someone who once wore a uniform. Make him proud. Make them proud. Susana Ashcroft. Outside, the first stars blinked awake in the indigo sky. I stood on the steps and breathed in the night, clean, still, free. Mission accomplished, I whispered. But in the same breath, I added what Grandpa would have said if he were here. Now get back to work, huh? The wind stirred, faint and approving, and somewhere beyond the quiet streets, I could almost hear his low, steady laugh, the sound of duty carried on the voice of love.